The United States operates the most powerful Navy on Earth. 11 aircraft carrier strike groups, a submarine fleet capable of projecting force anywhere on the globe, and a defense budget larger than the next 10 countries combined. And yet, as of March 2026, the American military cannot reopen a waterway that is 21 nautical miles wide. Not because it lacks firepower. It has more than enough to reduce every Iranian coastal battery to rubble. The problem is far more uncomfortable than that. Reopening the Strait of Hormuz requires capabilities the U.S. Navy retired last year. Legal standing it technically doesn't possess. Allies who refuse to show up. And an economic clock that punishes every day the operation takes longer than expected. How all four of those barriers converged at exactly the same moment is a story that goes well beyond the Persian Gulf. And it starts with understanding why this particular strip of water matters more than any other on the planet. On March 4th, 2026, Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. The declaration came days after the United States and Israel launched a coordinated bombing campaign against Iranian military targets, including strikes on Karg Island, the facility through which 90% of Iran's crude oil exports flow. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, responded by shutting down the most important maritime choke point on Earth and vowing to keep it sealed. What followed was not a theoretical exercise in geopolitical modeling. It was an immediate, measurable shock to global energy markets, and the beginning of a crisis that exposes vulnerabilities in American military planning that have been quietly accumulating for years. Consider a single number: 20.9 million barrels per day. That was the average volume of oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz in the first half of 2025. Roughly 20% of all petroleum liquids consumed globally, and a full quarter of all oil traded by sea anywhere on Earth. On top of that, 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas trade passes through the same narrow corridor. There is no comparable choke point. The Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, the Strait of Malacca, none carry this concentration of energy supply through such a confined space. When the Strait of Hormuz closes, the global energy market doesn't adjust gradually. It seizes. The geography makes everything worse. The strait sits between Oman and Iran, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the open waters of the Arabian Sea. At its narrowest point, it measures just 21 nautical miles across, meaning every vessel transiting the waterway must pass through the territorial waters of either Iran or Oman. There is no international corridor running through the middle. Commercial shipping is funneled into a designated traffic separation scheme north of Oman's Musandam Peninsula, creating a predictable, congested lane where tankers move in essentially single file. From the Iranian coastline, that shipping lane sits within range of virtually every weapon system Tehran possesses: anti-ship missiles, fast attack boats, naval mines, shore-based artillery. All of it can reach the traffic lanes without leaving Iranian territory. The strait is a gauntlet, and the physical terrain hands every advantage to the defender sitting on its northern shore. Which raises the question at the center of this entire crisis. If the United States has the most capable Navy in history, why can't it simply force the strait back open? The answer involves four distinct barriers: legal, military, diplomatic, and economic. And each one is more problematic than it first appears. More critically, they interact with and reinforce each other in ways that no single solution can address. Start with the legal dimension because it shapes everything that follows. The core dispute centers on a distinction in international maritime law that most people have never heard of, but that now carries enormous geopolitical weight. The difference between transit passage and innocent passage. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, straits used for international navigation are governed by transit passage, which grants all vessels, including warships and submarines, the right to pass through without interference. Military ships can transit in combat formation. Submarines can travel submerged. Aircraft can overfly the strait. Transit passage, in practical terms, gives naval forces nearly unrestricted freedom of movement through international straits. Iran, however, has signed UNCLOS but never ratified it. Tehran's legal position is that the more restrictive regime of non-suspendable innocent passage applies instead. Under innocent passage, foreign warships may still technically transit, but submarines must navigate on the surface. Overflight rights for foreign aircraft do not exist, and the passage itself must be continuous, expeditious, and genuinely innocent in character. A naval task force clearing mines, engaging coastal defenses, and escorting convoys through waters that Iran considers sovereign does not meet any reasonable definition of innocent passage. Tehran argues that transit passage is a creation of UNCLOS and only applies between states that have ratified the convention. Since Iran has not ratified it, the concept simply doesn't bind them. And here is where the legal picture becomes genuinely awkward for Washington. The United States has also never ratified UNCLOS. American administrations have long maintained that transit passage rights reflect customary international law and apply universally, regardless of treaty membership. That position has support in legal scholarship, but it becomes significantly harder to enforce diplomatically when you are asking other nations to join a military operation justified by legal rights derived from a treaty you yourself have refused to join. The legal foundation for a U.S.-led coalition to forcibly reopen the strait is not as solid as it might appear from a distance. And Iran's legal team understands that vulnerability precisely. If the legal barriers complicate coalition building, the military barriers complicate the operation itself. And these are the ones that should alarm anyone paying close attention. Because the United States made a decision in 2025 that now looks, in retrospect, like spectacularly poor timing. Throughout decades of American naval presence in the Persian Gulf, mine countermeasure capability was anchored by the Avenger-class minesweepers, wooden-hulled ships specifically designed to detect and neutralize naval mines in confined, contested waters. 4 of these vessels, the USS Devastator, the USS Dexterous, the USS Gladiator, and the USS Sentry, were stationed in Bahrain, positioned precisely for the scenario that is now playing out. They were old. They were unglamorous. They had none of the technological sophistication that defense procurement officials like to showcase in congressional briefings. But they had something that no amount of sophistication can substitute for: a long, proven operational history in the Persian Gulf. In 2025, the Navy decommissioned all 4 of them. The replacements are Independence-class littoral combat ships, equipped with new mine countermeasure mission packages. Vessels like the USS Canberra and the USS Santa Barbara carry unmanned surface vehicles, airborne laser mine detection systems, and autonomous capabilities designed to keep human sailors out of the minefield while machines handle the dangerous work of hunting and clearing mines. On paper, the technology represents a generational leap. In reality, not a single one of these systems has ever been used in combat. If they are deployed to clear Iranian mines from the Strait of Hormuz, it will be the first time the LCS mine countermeasure package has been tested under actual wartime conditions. The gap between a technology demonstration and a combat deployment is not trivial. Systems that perform flawlessly in controlled exercises fail in unpredictable ways when subjected to the chaos, electronic warfare environment, and physical damage of real conflict. Software glitches that would be minor inconveniences during a training exercise become operational paralysis when there are live mines in the water and anti-ship missiles inbound from the coast. And if the autonomous mine hunting systems do experience failures, there is no proven fallback capability sitting in reserve at Bahrain anymore. The Avenger-class ships are gone. The safety net has been removed at exactly the moment it is needed most. If you're beginning to see how these vulnerabilities layer on top of each other, legal gaps weakening coalition legitimacy, untested technology creating operational uncertainty, drop your assessment in the comments, because the next dimension makes the picture considerably worse. Iran's defensive strategy does not depend on mines alone. Tehran has constructed what military planners describe as a layered anti-access area denial system, the kind of integrated defense architecture designed to make the Strait of Hormuz as costly as possible for any force attempting to transit or clear it. The mines represent the first layer, and as of early March 2026, Iran had deployed fewer than 10. That number sounds small until you understand the tactical reality. A single mine can immobilize or destroy a vessel, and the confirmed presence of even a handful of mines forces every ship in the area to slow down, proceed with extreme caution, and follow predictable clearance corridors. That predictability is precisely what the second layer is designed to exploit. Iran's coastal batteries are armed with supersonic anti-ship missiles, the Khalij Fars and the Abu Mahdi, the latter capable of striking targets at ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers. These weapons can be launched from mobile platforms hidden along Iran's extensive mountainous coastline, targeting both the warships providing escort and the mine countermeasure vessels that are, by necessity, moving slowly and predictably through clearance operations. A ship conducting mine hunting operations is an inherently vulnerable target. It must move deliberately, hold position while its systems scan the seabed, and operate in locations that the enemy can anticipate. That profile makes it an ideal target for precision-guided anti-ship weapons fired from concealed positions on shore. The third layer involves Iran's fleet of fast attack craft, small, heavily armed speedboats designed for swarm tactics in confined waters. These boats can deploy in large numbers from dispersed positions along the coast, converging on targets from multiple directions simultaneously. In the narrow environment of the Strait, where large warships have limited room to maneuver and engagement timelines compressed to seconds, coordinated swarms of 20 or 30 armed speedboats can overwhelm the point defense systems that escort vessels rely on. Each individual boat is expendable. The threat comes from the volume and simultaneity of the assault. Defending against a coordinated swarm attack while simultaneously conducting mine clearance and protecting commercial convoys is an extraordinarily complex tactical problem, even for a navy with no peer competitor on the open ocean. Now layer the diplomatic reality on top of the military and legal challenges, because this is where the gap between American expectations and international willingness becomes starkest. On March 14th, 2026, President Trump called on nations affected by the Strait's closure to send warships to help keep the waterway open, stating that the United States would be bombing the hell out of the shoreline in the meantime. The international response was, to characterize it generously, underwhelming. The United Kingdom, America's closest military ally, said it was intensively looking at what could be done, but made no commitment to deploy warships. France went further, explicitly confirming it would not send ships and would maintain a strictly defensive posture. Japan, which imports a substantial share of its energy through the strait, described the threshold for deploying warships as extremely high and stated it must be considered with great caution. South Korea, which sources 70% of its oil from the Persian Gulf and faces enormous economic exposure, offered only that it was monitoring the situation and exploring measures to ensure safety, language that falls well short of any military commitment. And China, the world's largest oil importer and arguably the country with the most to lose from a prolonged closure, called for hostilities to stop and reminded all parties of their responsibility to ensure stable energy supplies, while offering nothing resembling military participation. The reluctance is not irrational. Providing naval escorts through the Strait of Hormuz is expensive, operationally demanding, and places participating warships directly within the engagement envelope of Iran's anti-ship missiles, fast attack craft, and mine threats. Any nation that sends ships risks having them damaged or sunk in a conflict it did not initiate, potentially dragging it into a broader war with Iran that it has no domestic political mandate to fight. For countries like Japan, South Korea, and European NATO members, the political cost of losing a warship and the sailors aboard it in someone else's conflict would be domestically devastating. The calculation is blunt. The economic damage of the Strait's closure is enormous, but for most governments, the political and military risks of joining an American combat operation to reopen it are judged to be even larger. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the time, because the economic dimension of this crisis is developing rapidly, and the numbers reveal the timeline pressure the Trump administration is operating under in ways that no amount of military rhetoric can obscure. The economic consequences of the closure are not projections. They are already reshaping global markets in real time. When U.S. military operations against Iran began, the international benchmark for crude oil, Brent, jumped 8% almost immediately, climbing from $71.32 per barrel to $77.24. As the conflict continued and the strait remained sealed, Brent broke through the $100 mark. The price surge affects not just crude oil, but the entire downstream chain of economic activity: transportation costs, manufacturing inputs, heating fuel, petrochemical feedstocks, fertilizer production, and consumer prices for virtually every good that is shipped, grown, or manufactured using petroleum-derived energy. The obvious question, why can't oil be routed around the strait, has a quantitatively devastating answer. Saudi Arabia and the UAE do have pipeline infrastructure capable of bypassing the Hormuz choke point. But the total available bypass capacity is approximately 2.6 million barrels per day. Compare that to the 20.9 million barrels per day that normally flows through the strait, and the shortfall is impossible to manage. Pipelines can offset roughly 12% of the lost volume. The other 88% has no alternative route. The physical infrastructure to reroute around this conflict does not exist at anything approaching the required scale. Then there is the insurance dimension, which functions as a second blockade layered on top of the physical one. The maritime insurance market, centered at Lloyd's of London, has responded to the conflict by raising war risk premiums for vessels transiting the Persian Gulf to between 1 and 1.5% of a ship's total insured value. For a large crude oil tanker, that translates to millions of dollars in additional cost per voyage, expenses that are passed directly to cargo owners and ultimately to consumers. Even if the U.S. Navy succeeds in clearing a corridor and offers military escorts, commercial shipping companies may still refuse to send vessels through if the insurance costs make the trip economically unviable. A militarily secured shipping lane can remain commercially empty because no operator can afford the premiums to use it. The financial blockade and the physical blockade reinforce each other, and solving one does not automatically solve the other. Congressional Research Service analysts assessing the situation have concluded that while the United States can ultimately restore the flow of shipping through the strait, the timeline remains highly uncertain, ranging from days to weeks to potentially months, depending on the extent of Iran's mining operations and the reliability of untested American mine countermeasure systems. Every day the strait remains closed, the economic pressure compounds. Oil prices climb. Insurance premiums rise. Inflationary effects ripple outward through economies worldwide. And within the United States, gasoline prices at the pump become a domestic political liability that directly threatens the Republican Party's positioning ahead of midterm elections. The administration is operating under an economic clock that punishes delay. But every operational, legal, and diplomatic reality points toward a timeline that stretches longer than the political and economic environment can comfortably absorb. The strategic options available are narrow, but not non-existent. Pursuing a UN Security Council resolution condemning the disruption of global energy supplies, rather than issuing unilateral demands for allied warships, could provide the legal and political cover that hesitant nations need. Countries like Japan and the United Kingdom, whose domestic politics make it nearly impossible to join an American military operation on a bilateral basis, might find it viable to contribute minesweeping and escort assets under an international mandate endorsed by the Security Council. Whether Russia or China would allow such a resolution to pass is an open question. But the diplomatic effort itself signals multilateral intent and shifts the political calculus for wavering partners. On the military side, the untested nature of the LCS mine countermeasure packages demands immediate redundancy. Forward deploying backup systems, spare components, and the technical contractors who built and maintain the autonomous mine hunting technology to the naval facility in Bahrain is not a gesture of confidence. It is a necessary hedge against the real possibility that first-generation combat deployment reveals problems peacetime testing never surfaced. The Navy cannot afford a scenario where a software failure halts clearance operations with no fallback available in theater. The insurance problem requires a government-level solution because the private market cannot absorb the risk at prices commercial operators can pay. Trump signed an order on March 3rd directing the provision of political risk insurance to maritime trade. But operationalizing that commitment, coordinating with Lloyd's of London to subsidize or cap war risk premiums for vessels traveling in U.S.-escorted convoys must happen at speed. A cleared shipping lane that no commercial vessel can afford to use accomplishes nothing. The insurance backstop is not a secondary concern. It is as operationally essential as the mine countermeasure missions themselves. If someone you know is trying to understand why fuel prices are rising and why events in the Persian Gulf ripple directly into daily life across every continent, share this with them. Because the Strait of Hormuz affects the cost of everything that moves, grows, or is manufactured anywhere on Earth. What separates this crisis from every previous Hormuz scare, the tensions of 2008, 2012, 2019, is that every prior episode involved threats and posturing, not an actual closure backed by deployed mines, activated missile batteries, and a government that has publicly committed to keeping the waterway shut. This is the scenario defense planners and energy analysts have warned about for decades. And it has arrived at the precise moment when the United States has retired its proven mine countermeasure fleet, replaced it with technology that has never seen combat, failed to assemble a willing international coalition, and operates under a legal framework that its adversary can credibly challenge in international forums. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 nautical miles wide. 20% of the world's oil flows through it. The U.S. Navy possesses the firepower to destroy every Iranian military asset within 100 miles of the waterway. And none of that changes the fundamental problem. Clearing mines takes time the economy cannot spare. Untested systems carry risks no one can quantify. Allies are not coming. The legal basis is contested. Insurance markets are frozen, and every day of delay costs the global economy billions of dollars and costs the administration political capital it cannot easily recover. The most powerful military force ever assembled is learning in real time that raw firepower and the ability to reopen a shipping lane are not the same thing, and that the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz have a way of equalizing advantages that seem overwhelming everywhere else on Earth.